Good evening. Today we are looking at Shabbat, Havdalah, and Jewish home ritual. So we're going to start off, remember this diagram from earlier. This is the entire Jewish calendar, the entire Jewish ritual year, and what's at the very center of the Jewish ritual year? That's right, it's Shabbat. Shabbat is at the very center, and all of these rays coming off from the middle, those are each of the Shabbats or Shabbatot throughout the year. It is at the very core of Jewish ritual life. It is our most important of all the holidays, Shabbat. How do we know what we're supposed to do to celebrate Shabbat? Well, luckily, the Torah tells us exactly how. Moses convoked the whole Israelite community, this is from Exodus, and said to them, "These are the things that Adonai has commanded you to do. On 6 days work shall be done, but on the 7th day you shall have a..." I lost my spot. "On the 7th day you shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to Adonai. And whoever does any work on it shall be put to death." Now this word work is one of the key words in this entire phrase. So the Torah tells us we've got this thing, it's called Shabbat. It tells us what we're supposed to do on Shabbat. It's supposed to be a day of complete rest in which you do no work. You shall kindle no fire throughout your settlements on the Sabbath day. It continues. A little bit later in that same chapter, we're still in Exodus 35, immediately after it says, "Do no work on Shabbat." And if you're wondering, well, is it really that important? Yes, if you don't do it, the penalty is death. That's pretty extreme, right? So it's got to be something really important to warrant that kind of an extreme penalty for violating. So what's happening here? Take a moment and read what's written in this passage. What are we talking about here? This is, if you said this is all about building the tabernacle in the wilderness, you're right. So how are we supposed to know what constitutes work in a Jewish sense, in a ritual sense? Well, if we keep reading, "Let all among you who are skilled come and make all that Adonai has commanded." Here are all of the instructions. And it continues with further instructions. And here at the end, "And everyone who excelled in ability," you see where I'm reading right here? "Excelled in ability, and everyone whose spirit moved him came, bringing to Adonai his offering for the work," malacha, it's the same word that we saw just a few verses earlier, telling us about don't work on Shabbat. "Do the work of the tent of meeting for all its service and sacral vestments." So here we have very specific instructions regarding in this context, what constitutes work. Excuse my camera adjustments. In this context, exactly what constitutes work. And we find it right there in the Torah, in the same chapter that says don't work on Shabbat. And it uses the same word. Well, the rabbis took these two instances of the same word occurring, and they said, wait a minute, maybe there's a connection here between work and work. It's the same word, it's the same chapter. Maybe this is the work that's prohibited. All of the different types of labor that went into building the Mishkan, these are the types of labor that are prohibited on Shabbat. And so out of that, now we're talking about the Mishnah, which is 1,000 years later, or maybe even a couple thousand years later, in which we read the primary labors, meaning malachot, are 40 less 1. What's 40 less 1? That's 39. So you might have heard, or you might have, certainly you read in your readings about the 39 malachot, the 39 categories of work on Shabbat, the 39 categories of prohibited work on Shabbat. And you see all of these: sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, selecting, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, shearing wool, bleaching, hackling. I can go through the whole list, but you see that this is all about the things that were used, the types of work that were done to build the Mishkan, to build the tabernacle in the wilderness. And so these are the 39 specific categories of work that are prohibited on Shabbat. Hold on, I see there's somebody waiting to get into the room. So we ended up with these 39 categories of work that says, okay, the Torah says don't do work on Shabbat. We saw in the same chapter different types of work described, and here they are laid out. These are the things that are prohibited on Shabbat. Now you might notice there are some things missing from this list. There's nothing in here about driving. There's nothing in here about using a light switch, right? So what's going on here? We're going to get to that a little bit later. We're looking at the Shabbat laws, the earliest versions of Shabbat. Although the Torah prohibits various kind of work, melachot, in all their details, now we're talking about the 14th century, this is a little bit later, again, about another 1,000 years later. Although the Torah prohibits various kinds of work, various kinds of malachot, and all of their details, a person might still toil all day long at those things which do not fall into that category. It is to forestall this possibility that the Torah says, you shall rest. So even if you were avoiding every category of work, it's still possible that you would be doing labor. I'm going back to this list of the 49 types of work. You might notice some in here that are going to be very important later on. So for example, you probably don't spend a lot of time shearing wool, but you might spend some time writing letters. Making 2 letters or erasing 2 letters are each a category of prohibited work. There's also one which says striking with a hammer. Do you see that here at the bottom? That's an extremely important one as far as Jewish law is concerned, because that's striking something with a hammer is understood to mean putting the final touch on something. And so it ends up being applied very broadly as Jewish law evolves over the centuries. By the way, if you didn't catch on, that's exactly what we're looking at here. How does Jewish law evolve over the centuries? Starting off with the broadest category of this is what the Torah says, and moving on to some of the more, the later categories of how do we interpret and understand what the Torah means when it says, do no work on Shabbat. So as we get into the medieval era, there's already this understanding that, well, there are certain jobs that you could do that really you could do all of your labor and not be violating any of these 39 malachot. For example, what if you're a counselor or a life coach? What if you're a physical trainer? As long as you're not moving things from one domain to another, from one building to another, so to speak, you could be lifting weights and giving people instructions. You could be a personal trainer. What about a massage therapist? What about any number of different types of services that a person can provide, different types of jobs a person could have, where you're not doing any of those categories of work? Or I'll put them up one more time so you can get a look at them. If you're not writing or erasing, if you're not carrying from one place to another, if you're not creating something out of raw materials, building or constructing something, and that probably describes a lot of jobs that you've had. You could still be doing that job. You could labor and toil, as the Magid Mishnah says, and still not be violating any of those 39 malachot. So as a result, the Torah says, and you shall rest. This is a later interpretation, you see? Already, some 600 years ago, we're beginning, or 700 years ago, well, 600. He was late 14th century. We're beginning to see this question of, are the 39 malachot, is that really what Shabbat is all about? Let's jump forward a few hundred years. Now this is from a Reform responsa. This is where we are a Reform synagogue. This is where the halacha of the Reform movement comes from. We send in questions. Usually a rabbi or somebody from a congregation will send in questions to the responsa committee, who will then offer their detailed response on here's what the guidelines should be. In this responsa we read, and I will go ahead and read the whole thing here because I think it's important. The seventh day is for us, meaning Reform Jews, as it is for other Jews, Shabbat Kodesh. What is Shabbat Kodesh? It means a holy day of rest. A sacred time, possessing a character which differentiates it from other days. An inescapable component of this sanctity is the recognition that certain activities ought not be performed on Shabbat, for to indulge in them would violate the essence and spirit of the holy day as we perceive these to be. Our list of forbidden activities, quote unquote, may differ and be markedly smaller than that maintained by the traditional halacha, but the spirit behind these prohibitions demonstrates that we regard the issue of Shabbat observance with the utmost seriousness. As one of my dear professors used to say, we take the Torah seriously, if not literally. To put it even better, the famous Israeli writer Echad Ha'am said, more than the Jewish people has kept the Sabbath has kept the Jewish people. This is one to add in the margin of your notes. Are you guys at home taking notes? This would be a good session to take some notes for, by the way. There's going to be a lot of information in here that will be very helpful going on in your Jewish journey, regardless of where you are starting at this moment in your Jewish journey. Let's look a little bit more at Shabbat. The rituals which define Shabbat. We just read the rituals are very important. We take them very seriously. So what are those rituals that we're talking about? Synagogue services, number one. Let me put in my own plug. Come to services. If you're not already coming to services, that is a great way to observe Shabbat. We make it very easy. Right now, all of our services are online. If you have a computer, if you have a phone, if you have anything with a screen that's connected to the internet, you can come to services. You don't even have to get in a car. You don't have to worry about the logistics of getting there. Although we are very excited for and looking forward to a time when it's safe to hold services in the sanctuary once again. At least for now, you can come to Shabbat services without having to go anywhere. It's the peak in convenience and luxury. Shabbat services consist of two major services. The evening, which is known as Shabbat Ma'ariv or Kabbalah Shabbat. Technically speaking, Kabbalah Shabbat is the opening section of the Shabbat evening service. But we often refer to the entire service as Kabbalah Shabbat, which literally means receiving Shabbat. We show up ready to and prepared to receive Shabbat. Welcome in the Sabbath day. That is followed the next morning by morning services. Shabbat Shacharit, which means Shacharit is a morning service, Ma'ariv is an evening service. Whether it's on Shabbat or another day, you also have weekday Ma'ariv, weekday Shacharit, and so on. How do we mark this special day? In the evening, especially by lighting candles. Now, the history of lighting candles is very fascinating. Why do we light candles on Shabbat? It was not always this way. Moses, I hate to break it to you, Moses did not light Shabbat candles. Moses didn't even have candles. But further than that, Moses didn't light any lights on Shabbat. It was later in Talmudic times, there was a deep disagreement between the Samaritans and between the Rabbinites, two different groups of Jews. Actually, it may have been the Rabbinites and the Karaites. I'll have to double check that later. Two different groups of Jews who had different interpretations of those 39 malachot. You might notice in that verse that we read, it said, light no fires on Shabbat. Well, one group of Jews said that means you can't have any fire at all whatsoever, no fires burning, put out all the fires before Shabbat starts. The other group said, no, it says don't light any fires. If God said don't have any fire, that's what the Torah would say, if that's what God wanted. But because the Torah says don't light any fires, davka, that means, specifically that means that you're allowed to have a fire as long as it's lit before Shabbat. Now, in the ancient world, this makes a huge difference in terms of what life is like during Shabbat. Why is that? If you have a fire and you're allowed to keep it burning throughout Shabbat, well then that means that you can have food that's hot and you can enjoy Shabbat. That was the argument of the rabbis. They said Shabbat is supposed to be a day of celebration. They're supposed to have a feast. It's supposed to be, this wonderful day for the Jewish people. So, of course, you have to have you have to be able to have a fire, because how can you have a nice day if you can't have a hot meal? Who wants a cold deli sandwich when you're having a nice meal? And so how did they show that it was okay to have fire on Shabbat? They created this ritual of lighting lights. Originally, they were oil lamps, specifically at the beginning of Shabbat, or just before the beginning of Shabbat. And that's how they marked the beginning of Shabbat, and that's how they showed that it was okay. That's how they showed their followers it's okay to have fire burning during Shabbat, so you can leave your stew roasting all day, you can have your cholent and eat it too, right? That was a joke. I saw one chuckle. This evolved into the traditions of This eventually evolved into the traditions that we know today of lighting candles, and there are a variety of different traditions. Oil eventually became candles in Europe because have you seen what happens to olive oil when it gets very cold? I don't know. Anybody here ever lived in a really cold climate? Anybody ever put the olive oil in the refrigerator by mistake? It gets cloudy and ugly. It separates. It doesn't burn very well. It sort of ruins it. Not to mention the fact that if you're in Ukraine or Poland and you're trying to even get olive oil to celebrate Shabbat, it's going to be a big challenge. So you want to light your Shabbat lights, but you can't get olive oil, and even if you could, it wouldn't be very nice, and you want things to be nice on Shabbat. It's a holiday, it's a celebration. Things are supposed to be special, they're supposed to be ideal. So they started using candles, and there are a lot of laws relating to what candles you're allowed to use and which ones you aren't. But these days, just about any candles you use should be more or less okay. Of course, you can also buy Shabbat candles specifically. Usually you'll find them in the kosher section of the grocery store. One custom developed that each family should light 2 candles, symbolizing the 2 commandments, the 2 separate times that Shabbat is commanded. Shamor, keep Shabbat, and Zachor, remember Shabbat. So you're supposed to observe Shabbat and keep Shabbat, 2 separate commandments that are related as it appears twice in the Torah. So many families have a custom of lighting 2 candles, but that's not the only custom. Originally, it was not 2 candles, it was just 1 candle. It became 2 candles, and some families even have a custom. For example, in some ultra-Orthodox and Haredi circles, it's common for each person in the family to light a candle or to have a candle that's lit. So if you have the father and the mother and 6 children, which if you're in a Haredi household would not be very uncommon at all, then you would light 8 candles, 1 for each of the children, and 1 for mom and dad, of course. And what is a celebration without wine? So, of course, we have Kiddush. Wine is what we use for every Jewish celebration to mark joy and celebration and sanctity. There's also a custom of 2 chalot, 2 challahs, 2 loaves of bread. Literally, the word challah refers to the part of the bread you don't eat. There's an ancient custom for kosher bread in which after you make the dough, you cut off a portion and you burn it up, or you some practice today that you bake it separately and then give it away to the poor instead of burning it up. Although there are many people that still take that piece and burn it up completely. And that piece that you burn up is called the challah. And what's left is the bread from which challah has been taken. But that gets shortened to challah bread. So if you want to be very technical, if you want to be very specific, the challah that you get at HEB is not actually challah, it's challah style bread. But I say go ahead and keep using it. Although if you ever want to make your own challah, you can research a little bit about how to take the piece of challah and give that little extra piece to a neighbor or a friend, or if you're able to give it to somebody who's in need, then that's a beautiful custom that you can try out as well. Why are there 2 chalot for Shabbat? That is connected with in the wilderness. After our people left Egypt, we were wandering in the wilderness and we had no food except for the food which God provided us, known as manna. The manna came as 1 portion every day of the week, but as 2 portions on Shabbat. So on Shabbat, you could collect 2 portions and you wouldn't have to go out and collect during Shabbat. It would last you throughout the day, and you would collect again on Sunday. So we have 2 challahs representing the double portion that we received in the wilderness. Shabbat is not complete without a festive meal. This can be Shabbat evening, it can be Shabbat afternoon, any time during Shabbat. Usually those are the 2 most common, when you have a festive Shabbat meal that celebrates the joyous day, because again, it's a holiday. During Shabbat, when we pray, we have some liturgy that's specific to Shabbat. Excuse me, my throat's a little bit dry today. To begin Shabbat in the evening, we have psalms and psalms and mystical poetry that we read. That is what's known as the Kabbalah Shabbat portion of the Shabbat service. These psalms that we read reflect the ancient psalms that were recited at the temple, and the mystical poems, for example, Lachadodi, or Ana B'Koach, which we don't do very often, but we could, or Shalom Aleichem. These mystical poems were written in the medieval period, in the 13 and 1400s, or 1500s, depending on which one, by the mystics mostly based in Tzfat, Israel, who had this whole movement of rejuvenating Shabbat celebration and making it a more spiritual, more communal practice. And one of the things that they did is that they wrote special poems praising God, and they often use mystical symbols within them. There are also special prayers that we only say on Shabbat. For example, Vishamru. It's a prayer that's all about Shabbat, and so we say it on Shabbat, but we don't say that on other days that we pray. There's Shabbat Kiddush, which is a special prayer sanctifying Shabbat. Blessing your children, especially on Shabbat evening. It's common to bless your children as a part of the Shabbat liturgy. Some people do it in the evening, some people do it in the morning. And that's the special blessings of, may you be like Ephraim and Manasseh for boys, may you be like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah for girls. On Shabbat, we have Torah reading. We also have Torah reading on some of the days of the week that are designated as reading Torah days. Reading Torah days? I don't know. However you want to call it. Certain days that are designated as Torah reading days during the week, but definitely on Shabbat, we have the Shabbat Torah service, which is even larger and more grand than the Torah reading during the week. We also have an extra service. You remember when we were talking about Jewish prayer services, we talked about the 3 services, morning, afternoon, and evening. We have a Musaf service, an additional, literally Musaf means additional. It's the same word as Haftarah. After you read the Torah, you read the Haftarah, the additional reading. And Musaf, which also means additional. I know, they don't sound like the same word, but they are. Or the Maftir, rather. The Maftir Torah reading is the additional reading. Musaf also means additional. It's a different word for additional, which is an additional service during the day that happens in between the morning service and the afternoon service. On Shabbat, we have a shortened Amidah. We talked about when we were discussing the Amidah, we talked about the 18 blessings, although there's really 19 of them. You remember that? Well, if you've only come to services, if you only pray in a Jewish service on Shabbat, you might be wondering, what is the rabbi talking about these 19 blessings? I don't remember ever saying 19 blessings in the Amidah, because our Amidah is shortened. On Shabbat, we don't do labor, and we also don't ask God to do labor. And so as a result, we have all of the blessings in which we are asking God to provide us something, we leave those out on Shabbat, and we have a shorter Shabbat Amidah service. Now let's talk about this relationship between work and rest. The Orthodox understanding is highly focused and increasingly highly specialized and specified based on those 39 malachot and the interpretations on top of those 39 malachot that have happened over the past few hundred years. So for example, think about turning on a light switch. In the early days of widespread use of electricity, the question came up. We're talking maybe 100 years ago, not that long ago. The question came up, can we use iridescent or incandescent lights, rather, on Shabbat? Normally, you would go around your house and you would light all your oil or gas lamps around your house. That would light your home, and you could adjust the gas, turn it on and off, so that you could have more or less light in your home. Same thing on the streets. The street lamps were all gas. You had somebody whose job was the gas lighter, who would go around and light all of the gas lamps down one side of the street and then up the other side. The lamp lighter, right? That used to be a job. See, technology eliminates jobs. It's actually not true, but that's another conversation for another time. Technology almost always creates jobs, but that's, my undergraduate was in economics. Another conversation for another time. I'm getting off track. So we now had these light bulbs, these electric light bulbs that were a replacement for fire. Everybody agreed and everybody knew in the Jewish world that if you were observing Shabbat, according to Orthodox understanding, you would not be lighting lamps in your home. Now you've replaced those lamps with light bulbs, and the rabbis are faced with this dilemma. They say, you know what? It just feels wrong. There's got to be something wrong with lighting an electric light because it's serving the same purpose, it's doing the same thing, but it's doing it in a different way, that technically it's not lighting a fire. Well, they said maybe it is lighting a fire, because how does a light bulb work? Well, the electricity goes in, it heats up the metal, the filament, and the filament, as a consequence of being heated up, that produces light. And that is close enough to being fire. It's heat that results in, it's heating something up so that it gives off light and heat. And that is close enough to being fire. So we're going to say no electricity on Shabbat. Well, that was fine until a few years later, electricity became even more popular, and now you had not just light bulbs, but a lot of other devices that used electricity. The rabbi said, well, we already said no electricity, so how do we explain these other things? Well, maybe it's, what about turning on a vacuum cleaner or turning on a blender? Well, they said maybe it's molid, maybe it's creating a new thing, right? Because the blender, when it's not plugged in and switched on, it's not really a blender. It's not an appliance that's fulfilling its job. So they said, okay, forget what we said about fire. Electricity is not fire. Although there were arguments that, well, whenever you turn on or off an electric switch, there's a spark, and that spark is the same as a spark that starts a fire. So they had to change the halacha again. Yes, you heard me right. I said it. They changed the halacha. They said, no, it's not about starting a fire. We were wrong when we said that. It's really about creating something new, because the blender, when it's off, isn't really a blender until you turn it on, then it becomes a blender. But there were some problems with that as well. So they said maybe it's building, it's construction. You're not supposed to build something new. You're not supposed to construct something. on Shabbat. And you're taking the electricity and you're combining it with the appliance, you put it together and they work. So it's building something from component parts, and that is what's forbidden. And then there were some arguments about that didn't really make sense. They said, well, maybe it's about striking a hammer. Remember when I told you to pay attention about striking a hammer? That is putting the final touch on something, which even if it doesn't violate any of the other rules for Shabbat, putting a final touch on something is considered a violation of Shabbat in itself. So turning on an electrical device is really completing its purpose. And so they said, well, maybe it's like striking a hammer. And then there were some other rabbis who said, but a lot of devices you turn on and off and on and off. It's not really its final state. It's just a temporary state. And so this is an ongoing discussion in Orthodox halakha. Every Orthodox rabbi agrees that you're not supposed to use electricity on Shabbat, but all of these Orthodox rabbis can't agree on why. That's how Orthodox interpretation, and I'm just using one example of electricity, but there are lots of things that have to do with Shabbat that are problematic. There are some solutions that the Orthodox have come up with to get around these problems with electricity, using special timers. If you have an electrical timer that turns on and off on its own, well, it's not you turning it on and off, so it's allowed. If you have a refrigerator, somebody might call you up and say, is your refrigerator running? That's an old joke. I should be careful with that. That joke is older than some of this halakha I'm talking about. Is your refrigerator running? You never got that? Okay. You better go catch it. So, sorry. If you've got a refrigerator and you're following this Orthodox interpretation, this present-day Orthodox interpretation of halakha, you would unscrew or turn off the light bulb for all of those reasons that I discussed. But what about opening the refrigerator and then the temperature drops and then the refrigerator motor turns on? Do you have to unplug the whole refrigerator? No. They say, well, if you open the door to get something, your intention is not to turn on the motor turns on by itself. So if something electrical happens by itself, then it's not a matter of you violating something, it's just something which occurs on its own. So you can use an electrical timer. You plug the timer into the socket and you plug the appliance into it and it turns the light on, or whatever you want to turn on. Turns it on at a certain time, turns it off at a certain time. And as long as you set the timer before Shabbat, then it can operate on its own. You also see Shabbat elevators in Israel and in some other cities that have a large Jewish population. Shabbat Elevator is an elevator with a special setting for Shabbat where it will stop and the doors open and close and it goes up and down all day long and it stops at every floor. You even have, you're waiting for me to get to this example here. This is a kosher switch. This is a product that was created a few years ago that claims to be the best way to use electricity on Shabbat, which is a light switch that you turn it on and then you wait a second and the lights in your room will come on. And you turn it off and you wait a second and the lights will turn off. That sounds an awful lot like a light switch. And that's the idea, that you use this in place of your normal light switches, even though the outcome is almost identical because it works in a very complicated way. It has a little laser inside or a little diode inside. When you move the switch, you're not actually moving the electrical switch, you're blocking the light from that diode, and then it goes into a processor automatically. You're just creating a shadow inside the device, and then it has a processor that creates a random number, and based on that random number, that's how long it will wait before turning off the lights. So there's a delay, and it's an automatic process. All you're doing is creating a shadow inside the device, and then the device is deciding to turn itself on or off. I've never actually seen these in real life, but I have seen ads for them. It is a real product that exists, and it is supported by a number of Orthodox rabbis who even say it's better than a regular light switch, because you might accidentally turn on or off a light switch without thinking about it on Shabbat. But this way you're covered. If you accidentally turn it on, that's okay, because it's a Shabbat kosher switch. What about the conservative interpretation of halakha and Shabbat? Conservative synagogues were faced with this major issue not too many years ago of people were starting to move away from living right next to the synagogue. People were moving to suburbs, and if you can't walk to synagogue, that's a problem for Shabbat. In a traditional community in the shtetl of Europe, in the towns of Morocco, wherever Jews might be living, the custom was to live within walking distance of the synagogue. But what happens when society changes, when people start driving, when people start owning cars and moving to the suburbs? Well, that's exactly what happened. In conservative Judaism, saw these synagogues which were burgeoning in cities all over America. All of a sudden, the attendance started going down and down and down because people were living too far away to get to walk to shul. So the conservative movement, the CJLS, the Conservative Jewish Law, I'm blanking on the acronym. I think it's CJLS, which is the body within the conservative movement that determines the official halakha of the conservative movement, said, well, we've got the positive mitzvah to pray with the community, to be a part of a minyan, and we've got the negative mitzvah, the prohibition. You know, when I say a positive and a negative mitzvah, that's a thou shalt and thou shalt not. Positive is you must do, negative is you shall not do. So you've got the positive commandment to attend shul, to be a part of a community, to be a part of a minyan, and the negative commandment, the prohibition against driving on Shabbat. Why can't you drive? Well, because it's using an ignition, which is burning a fire, right? When you start your car, you're starting a little fire inside the engine. It's a controlled fire, ideally. If it's not a controlled fire, you're in big trouble. Call your mechanic. Don't call me. I won't be able to help you. But what the conservative movement determined was, well, a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment in this case. So you're permitted, if the only way you can get to synagogue is by driving, you're permitted to drive on Shabbat. This was the determination that the conservative movement made. It's this balance by following all of the mitzvot, but when two commandments are at odds with one another, that's when the conservative movement, as a matter of policy, has the ability to step in and say, which commandment do you follow if you can't follow both? An Orthodox rabbi would say, too bad, just move. What is the Reform interpretation? Here's where things get a little bit more interesting. We have to think about what it really means to work or to rest. If you're spending your whole day obsessing about, oh my gosh, I didn't tear enough pieces of toilet paper before Shabbat and I'm going to run out. If you go into an ultra-Orthodox home, before Shabbat, you have all of the toilet paper you have to tear ahead of time, because tearing was one of those categories. You remember those 39 categories of work? You can't tear So that means even when you go to the bathroom, you got to tear the toilet paper in advance so that you've got enough for Shabbat. And if you're worrying about, oh, what if I forget to unscrew the light bulb in the refrigerator? And what if I, mistakenly do this? What if I need to get in the car and it's an emergency, but it's not a life or death emergency? If it's a life or death emergency, almost every rabbi in the world will agree you get in your car and you go. But what if it's not a life or death emergency? What if it's just something really important, but I need to get in the car? And if you spend all day worrying about these dilemmas, are you really resting? Is that really what God expects from us on Shabbat? Or is Shabbat about something else entirely? In essence, the question that we ask is, should we spend Shabbat focused on work and refraining from work, or should we spend Shabbat focused on rest, on doing the things that make Shabbat special, unique, and separate from the rest of the week? As a very interesting side note, there is, in recent years, there's been a growing movement in Reform Judaism to have, at least in some ways, a more traditional Shabbat observance, because as cell phones and technology and our interconnected world have taken over our lives, it's more and more difficult for Shabbat to feel special and separate. If you work the kind of job where you have a cell phone, chances are people will call you when you're after work hours. People will call you on weekends. People will send emails and expect an immediate response. This is the type of connected world that we live in. And there's a growing movement to unplug on Shabbat, meaning turn off all the screens, turn off your cell phone, set it to do not disturb, and have a day of true rest that's separate from the worries of the week. That's the essence of Shabbat. When we conclude Shabbat, we celebrate with Havdalah. The word Havdalah literally means separation. This is the ceremony which separates Shabbat from the week, separates the holy from the ordinary. And in fact, that's one of the blessings that we say, blessed are you, God, who separates the holy from the ordinary. We celebrate Havdalah with three primary symbols: a cup of wine, sweet-smelling spices, and a braided candle of many wicks forming one flame. You'll read a lot about what these different symbols symbolize, what these different symbols mean in Judaism. And I think the bottom of this got cut off, the bottom of the picture. Oh well. You'll read a lot about what these different items symbolize. I'm not going to lay those out for you right now, because the truth is there are many different answers. But some of the answers might be here. This is a ceremony which appeals to all five of our senses, because you're physically touching and holding these different ritual items. It's very common to have a Havdalah service in a circle and actually pass around these different items, especially the Kiddush cup and the spices. You don't all necessarily want to pass around the candle. That can get dicey pretty quick. But by passing around these different elements of the service, you're physically touching them. You're smelling, you're tasting, you see the light, and when you extinguish the candle, what do? You take the cup here, you take the candle here. Psh, actually, I've got a Havdalah set right here. You take your candle, it's a little bit lopsided. You take your candle, you've got your cup here, and you extinguish the candle in the cup. Psh, and you hear the sound of the candle going out. They say that sizzle is the sound of Shabbat leaving. It's also said another reason for these symbols is that on Shabbat You get an extra soul, that there's a piece of your soul or an extra soul which dwells in heaven. But during Shabbat, because we are so engaged in holy things, that soul is able to come down and be with us. I don't know exactly what that means to have two souls. I don't know how many souls I have. I've never had the opportunity to count. But I think it's a beautiful way of thinking about what makes Shabbat so special, that it's almost like you have a new spirit, a renewed spirit, and that celebration is that extra bright light with many wicks that symbolizes that extra soul. The smell is an aroma, something which is immaterial, which is difficult to touch. Putting out that candle in the wine, that moment is when that extra soul leaves for Shabbat. Again, this is not necessarily a teaching we take literally, but we can still take it seriously. The meaning behind it, the spirit behind it, forgive the pun, is still there. And after we use all of these symbols, after we celebrate the Havdalah service and say the appropriate blessings, we sing Eliyahu Hanavi. We sing praises to the prophet Elijah, who we believe is present every Shabbat. We're waiting for Elijah, who's a symbol of the messianic times, a symbol of Mashiach, the coming age in which there will be total peace in the world among all people. There'll be no fighting, no anger, no discord or jealousy. There will be no disease, no hunger, no suffering in the world. That's the time we pray for. And ancient Jewish belief tells us it can't happen on Shabbat. The Messiah cannot arrive on Shabbat, whether you believe the Messiah is a literal person, or if you believe that the Messiah is a symbol of an age of humanity that we are striving for. We believe that it cannot happen on Shabbat because that would require working on Shabbat. And why would God send someone on Shabbat? Another interpretation, the Varacher, that that time will be like a true Shabbat, a time when we do not have to toil and fight and struggle day in and day out, but rather every day of our lives will be like a Shabbat. And so as Shabbat is leaving, we pray for Eliyahu Hanavi, the symbol of our hopes for the future, to come and to announce that time when we don't have to say goodbye to Shabbat anymore. That time when all of our lives are filled with the joy, the celebration, the sweetness, the ruach, the spirit of Shabbat. What makes a Jewish home? So that's Shabbat in a nutshell. What makes a Jewish home? Well, first of all, how about a mezuzah? Don't worry, we'll come back to this stuff in just a moment. We'll come back to that. The first most distinctive feature of a Jewish home, a Jewish household, is a mezuzah. If I'm driving around, somebody says, "Oh, Rabbi, can you come over and help me with such and such," whatever it might be. If I've never been to their house before, I'm always a little bit nervous because I don't know if I got the address right, and I don't want to be showing up at a stranger's doorstep, knocking on their door. It's happened to me before. It has happened to me. And they say, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" "I'm the rabbi." "We didn't call for a rabbi." Or, "What's a rabbi?" That's my favorite. Never heard of it before. The one thing that I always like to do is I look, and if I look at the door and I see there's a mezuzah, I think, okay, I'm in the right place. There's a mezuzah. At least if I'm in the wrong place, at least it's a Jewish family and they can help me out. So mezuzah is probably the most distinctive feature of a Jewish home, the most easily observed. You can see it from the outside. Ritual objects. Like I said, the Havdalah set, we'll talk about those in a moment. Jewish trappings. This is sort of a broad category that I put in everything else that you can physically touch and hold that's Jewish. And then there are Jewish practices like Kashrut and other Jewish practices that make the home itself Jewish. So let's take a look at a mezuzah. If we were having this class in person, this sample, I don't know if you can see this. I know it's pretty small, but this is what's written inside a Mezuzah scroll, on the front of the scroll. On the back, it also has a couple of things written on it, or just one. But the main writing is on the front. Can you guys see this? Or not really? Kind of, sort of? Okay. It might be hard to see. You might have to make the window bigger. By the way, if you're at home and you're watching this on a TV, that's like the best way to do it. You should be able to see all of those tiny pixels. And if you read even just a little bit of Hebrew, you can probably see this first word right here is Shema. And the word after that, Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. That is one phrase. I could open up any Torah scroll, any Mezuzah scroll, and if you know even just a little bit of Hebrew, that's at least a phrase you can read. So don't ever say, I can't read any Torah. If you know just a little bit of Hebrew, if you know your letters, you can figure out Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. If we were in person, I would use a different version of this where the name of God, Yud He Vav He, which appears in the Mezuzah, is grayed out or wiped out before I print it off, so that you can have a handout and you don't have to worry about, am I desecrating God's name if I put it in a folder and forget about it, or if I'm cleaning out my home Marie Kondo style and I have to throw it away in the future, you won't have to worry about it. But since this is an electronic form, here's an interesting exploration of halacha. Any words that are written in an electronic form are not considered words because they're not actually physically made out of ink. There's no physical material making up the words. It's really a very sophisticated optical illusion. So according to halacha, these are not words. They're just it's just an optical illusion that looks like words. So you don't have to worry, even if you want to have a very strict halachic practice, you can still print God's name on a computer screen and you can still study holy texts online in that way. You don't have to worry about creating and destroying God's name over and over again. The same phrase, the same passage in English, it comes from Deuteronomy 11:13-21, and it begins, "Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. You shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your resources." It's the translation here. "And these things which I command you today shall be upon your hearts, and you shall teach them to your children. You shall speak of them when you sit in your house, and when you go on the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up." Hopefully this is familiar to all of you. We say this just about every service. "And you shall bind them as a sign upon your arm or hand," that's tefillin. "They shall be an ornament between your eyes," that's the other part of the tefillin, the shel rosh. "And you shall write them upon the doorposts of your house and on your gates." So this is, you'll hear me use the phrase as I'm teaching, a self-describing ritual or a self-describing commandment. The mezuzah is a self-describing ritual object. This is something that we see in Judaism, where something describes itself. The Passover Seder is another great example. You'll see why that is in a couple of weeks. You want to know why we have a Passover Seder? Just have a Passover Seder. It explains itself. It's a self-explaining ritual. A mezuzah is a self-explaining object because the passage that's written on it you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. What do you write? You write this. You write the part that tells you to write it. It's brilliant. How do you actually, when you purchase a mezuzah, you get a new mezuzah. Oh, also I should point out, it says on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, that it's plural. It's not singular. Ideally, you should have a mezuzah on every doorway, door frame in your home. On your front door, if you can only afford one mezuzah, put it on your front door, but ideally find a way to put one on every doorpost of your house. If you have a gate that goes all the way over the top, not just a gate that opens side to side, if it's closed on the top, that's considered a gate that requires a mezuzah as well. If you have any questions about whether something needs a mezuzah or how to hang a mezuzah, call me. I love coming to people's homes to help them with the mezuzah. It's something that it's like so easy and such a nice way to get to know people. I love doing it, so you should never feel shy about calling me about a mezuzah. But in case you do want to do it on your own, it's 4 simple steps. Step 1 is you roll up the scroll. You'll have to choose whether you want a kosher scroll that's written by a scribe, that's written on parchment by hand by a scribe. Those can range in price between usually around $40 or $50, sometimes a little bit less. You might be able to get them for 20 something or 30 something. You might find some that are even more expensive, but think around that range for just the scroll by itself, which when you think of the work that goes into making one is one thing. If the way that the scroll is written is not important to you, and what is more important to you are the words written on the scroll, you can also have a mezuzah that's just printed on paper. Recognize that distinction. You know, again, you can have, when we are Reformed Jews, we have to ask these questions. What are the parts of Judaism that I really value? What's most important? What are the pieces that I'm going to spend a little bit of extra time, money, energy to do this ritual in a particular way? Or do I want to make sure that I can fulfill the ritual no matter what? If it's going to prevent you, if the cost is going to prevent you from hanging a mezuzah, I would rather that you use the paper scroll rather than saying, I'm not going to do it at all because I can't afford the scroll. Once you get that scroll, whether it's parchment or paper, you're going to roll it up in this particular direction. We've got the Shema facing towards you. You see Shema right here, facing towards you. You're going to roll it from the end to the beginning. When you do that, you'll also, by the way, see a word written on the back of the scroll. That one word that's written on the back of the scroll, which is another name for God, Shaddai, Shin Dalet Yud. Which is the reason you have a shin on a mezuzah scroll, or on a mezuzah case rather, that you can see the shin on the case so that you know that it says Shaddai. And that's what you should see when you finish rolling up the scroll. It'll be on the back, just behind, it's like right there, right there. Step 2, you're going to hang it at the bottom of the top third of your door. If that doesn't make sense, just look at this diagram over here. This gray area, you can see there's the door. I've divided it into thirds, and you can see there's the top third right there. And where do you hang the mezuzah? At the bottom of that top third. You hang it on the inside of the doorpost so that it's on the doorpost itself. If for some reason you can't hang it there, you can hang it on the front, on somewhere else on the doorpost. And on the right side as you enter a room. I grew up with a custom that you always hung it on the side where the door opens, which in this picture would be the left side, and that's a different custom. But the most common custom that you'll find is that you hang it on the right-hand side as you go in. so that it's close to your right-hand side. As you walk into a building, you can kiss the mezuzah. That's a custom that a lot of people have. If you're not sure which is the right-hand side of the door, you say, well, what if it's the door between two rooms and I go in between both of them? Well, is it the right hand from this direction or the right hand from that direction? Call me, I'll come help you. Step 3 is you recite the blessing. Once you've got the mezuzah in place, you recite the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu likboa mezuzah. This is a good one to have in your notes. You should find this in your books as well. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us to affix a mezuzah, likboa mezuzah. And then finally, you affix the mezuzah. Now that you've said the blessing, you always say the blessing before fulfilling a mitzvah. There's one exception to this. This will be extra credit after class if you can tell me the one mitzvah that we say the blessing after doing the mitzvah. Think about that one. It's one that you know. It's one that you know. There's one mitzvah that we do before we say the blessing, and there's a very interesting reason for it. But usually you say the blessing, and then immediately after saying the blessing, you do the mitzvah. You do the thing you said the blessing for. So then you affix the mezuzah, and it must be permanently affixed. What defines something as permanently affixed? Well, that can mean different things in different cases. If you are, for example, if you're living in an apartment, if you're living in a rented home, or you have a metal door frame and you're not sure about making holes in your door frame, give me a call. There's always a way to do it. Don't say, well, I've got a metal door frame and I don't want to drill any holes, so I just won't do a mezuzah. No, give me a call. We can figure it out. There's more than one way to affix a mezuzah. That should be like a phrase or something. Jewish ritual objects that you might find in your home. These are some examples. We already talked about all of these Shabbat things. You've got these special candlesticks to hold your Shabbat candles. You've got a Kiddush cup. It's a little bit cut off in this image, but you can see a Kiddush cup over there on the left. You've got a challah cover, a special fabric, cloth cover, sometimes very ornately decorated, to cover the challah while you're saying the blessings over the other items. There's a special board that the challah is on. There are all sorts of different things that you can use to celebrate Shabbat as ritual objects. You can find most of these, even right now, you can find most of these in the Sisterhood gift shop at the temple. Just give me a call, and or give Heather Fallock a call, who runs the gift shop right now, and we can make sure that whatever you need, we can get for you. Buying Judaica online is a risky venture. Sort of like when we talked about Hebrew names, looking for a Hebrew name online, it's okay if you know which site you can go to and you know which ones are reliable, but there's a lot of junk out there. Same thing for Judaica. If you know what site to go to, where to go to get good materials, you can do it very nicely, but it's a little bit of a risk. I can't tell you the number of people who have come to me in shock or in tears because they bought a particular item of Judaica on Amazon and it was not what they were expecting. How about a Havdalah set? You just saw, here's my personal Havdalah set. It's very lovely. You can see it's, this Havdalah set, is painted, focus, there we go, is, beautifully painted. It's designed to be something which is pleasing, which is a work of art in its own right. And you see this in a lot of Jewish ritual objects for your home. There's a principle called Kidur Mitzvah, which means beautifying a mitzvah. You can celebrate a mitzvah You can observe a mitzvah by fulfilling sort of the letter of the commandment. But of course, we don't want to just fulfill the letter of the commandment when we're talking about serving God. We want to do it in a way that celebrates it, that makes it beautiful. And so that's why it's very common to have beautiful ritual objects. What would you say to somebody who has, an amazing, beautiful, $100,000 car in their garage, and they have, amazing, beautiful furniture and amazing, beautiful paintings and decorations on the wall, and then their mezuzah is a little plastic box? That sort of sends the wrong message. That sends a signal about what's important, and Judaism would not be one of those, right? So that's why you often see this works of art translated into Jewish ritual objects, because it should be as a signal of how important it is, how valuable your Judaism is. It should be something which is as nice as you can reasonably, don't go into debt, but it should be something that's as nice as you can reasonably have. It should be among the most beautiful objects in your home. What about a menorah? We just celebrated Hanukkah not that long ago, less than a month ago. And all of you, I know, because I saw the pictures online and the pictures with your family, I love to see that. All of you were lighting menorahs, Chanukiot. How about, don't forget a tzedakah box, also known as a pushke. That's the Yiddish word, a pushke. It is a mitzvah to give to charity, to give to tzedakah. Charity is not an exact translation, as I think we've talked about, or we're going to talk about. I don't remember. Did we cover tzedakah already? I don't know. You want to make sure that you've got a tzedakah box in your home. And that can be as simple as, I've got some of those big mason jars, and I fill them up with change, and then once it's full, I give it to charity. Usually I just let it keep filling up, and then I give the equivalent amount to charity. I'll say, oh, the jar's full, I'm just going to make a donation on my credit card. However you choose to do it, making tzedakah a part of your home, this is a great way, if you have kids, to teach them about tzedakah and make it in a fun and interesting way, and something that has a physical presence in your home. It's a constant reminder every time you walk by, every time you see it, touch it, shake it and jingle it, that you are giving a part of your being, a part of the effort that you put into the world is towards tzedakah. How about a Seder plate? Can't have Passover without a Seder plate. There are many, many more examples, but this is a good starting point. This sort of covers your basics. If you've got all of this stuff in your home, then you are ready to begin to observe a Jewish life. Now, what do I mean by this category of Jewish trappings? What are some other things? Take a moment to think. What are some other things that you might find in a Jewish home? What did you come up with? Did you think of a ketubah? Yeah, if you're married, you should be married in a Jewish ceremony. And by the way, if you would like to have a Jewish ceremony, if you're already married and you're converting, for example, or if you have been Jewish your whole life, but you got married in a secular celebration, and you would like to have a ketubah, it's a beautiful thing to do on an anniversary, especially if it's a special anniversary, a big number that's important to you. Having a renewal of vows and creating and signing a ketubah is a beautiful way to mark that and to be a continued celebration of love. If you're not yet married, you'll want to look into getting a ketubah, and I would do it sooner than later, because a nice ketubah can take a while. It can take a few weeks. You can't get it on Amazon same-day delivery because it takes some work, it takes some effort. And a beautiful ketubah is often a work of art in itself. That's the Jewish wedding contract. What about Jewish artwork? You can see, actually, for example, right behind me, you can see a couple of examples. This is one that I made. You probably can't see it very well, but that's a mizrach. That's on the eastern wall of this room, which is where I pray from my home when I'm, praying on Saturday mornings or praying during the day. And I can turn and face this visual meditation about God. This was a gift from my dad, which shows two Jewish men in a workshop in like the shtetl, and there's some other examples around my home of Jewish artwork. That's again this celebration of Judaism in the form of even though it's not a mitzvah, there's no commandment that says you have to have a painting, but if you're going to have some kind of artwork, if you're going to be supporting the arts, even better if it's Jewish in character. What about Jewish books? You see a lot of books behind me here, and this is a mixture. Some of them are Jewish books, some of them are secular books. My books at home are not well organized. They're all mixed together, which is fine by me. Some of the Jewish books you already have in your home, you may have bought for this class. You may have purchased previously. Probably you want a Tanakh or a Chumash. A Tanakh, that's the Hebrew Bible. A Chumash, that's the Torah in a book form that usually has commentaries and translation and different things like that. Probably want some books about Jewish practice, philosophy, Jewish ideas, famous Jewish figures. A really popular book that you used to see in just about every Jewish home was by Rabbi Telushkin, which was the Jewish 100, the 100 Jews who changed history. Something like that. I forget the exact title. I think I see some of you nodding. You've got that on your shelves at home. You recognize it. Blessing of the home. It's very common to have a blessing hanging on a wall that is blessing your home with the Jewish home blessing. There's also, by the way, Jewish blessing for a business. If you own a business or you have a place of business where you have things hanging up, you can get a blessing for your business for prosperity and blessing there as well. Something else you might find in a Jewish home is Kashrut, Jewish practice. You go into a Jewish kitchen, you might see two sets of, you go into my kitchen, for example, I have two sets of dishes, two sets of silverware. It gets expensive pretty fast and it uses up all your drawers, but it is a way of connecting with Jewish practice and Jewish tradition, one for meat and one for dairy. But where does this whole idea of kashrut come from in a Jewish home? Well, it's biblical. There are certain passages of the Bible that specifically say, you can read about it in Parshat Shmini, some animals are forbidden. You can't eat any land roaming animals, anything that roams the earth, unless it is an animal with cloven hooves and chews its cud. Anything that doesn't meet those categories, you can't eat. So pig is out, giraffe is okay, but you have to know how to shecht it. Giraffe chews its cud, has cloven hooves, you can eat a giraffe. You can eat deer. Again, as long as it's slaughtered in the correct way, it's not a wild deer. It has to be one that's raised, domesticated. You can, but you can't eat pork. Pigs have cloven hooves, but they don't chew their cud, so they're sneaky. That's why pigs are. That's why pork specifically is historically the most objectionable food. I know Jews who will eat shellfish, which is another category that's forbidden based on things that swim in the sea. Jews that will eat that will eat meat and dairy together, but they will never eat pork. It happens. It's part of this Jewish tradition that we, for whatever reason, pork is considered especially bad throughout the ages of Judaism, even going back to biblical times. I'll talk about that in a moment as well. Some of kashrut doesn't come from a literal passage in the Bible where it says, do not eat such and such an animal. but rather an interpretation of the Bible. So for example, there are 3 times that we see the passage, do not seethe a kid in its mother's milk. This phrase shows up 3 times in the Torah. And so we interpret it as having 3 separate meanings. Number 1, don't literally drown a kid in its mother's milk or cook a kid in its mother's milk. Number 2, don't get enjoyment from, meaning don't eat meat and milk together. And 3, don't get benefit from it. You can't sell hamburgers as an Orthodox Jew. Kashrut is about separation in practice. A lot of Judaism is about making separations, making distinctions, saying, it's not all just a gray area, that there are some things that are separate. And having this separation in the food that you eat means that even the act of eating, the mundane act of eating, something that every person does every single day, unless you're doing intermittent fasting, that's like a new trend now, right? Unless you're doing that, you're eating every single day. It's the most mundane activity you can imagine. But what do we do as Jews? We take the mundane and we sanctify it. Our job as a nation of priests, as the Tanakh tells us, we are a nation of priests. And what do? We elevate the ordinary. We make the ordinary into the extraordinary. We make the ordinary into the sacred. Even the mundane act of eating becomes sacred by attaching these practices. Why did this whole thing come about? Now, I'm going to pause here for just a moment. We still have a few slides to go talking about Kashrut. I hope that some of you can stay around after, but we are actually at our 90-minute time. I'm going to keep going. This will be available online. If you need to sign off now, you can do so. That's fine. We understand. Our time is up, but I'm going to keep going because I'm trying to squeeze a lot into 1 week. You can always go back and catch up on the YouTube channel. This will be uploaded shortly. Why do we have kashrut? The number 1 reason is nobody knows. The Torah says this is what you're supposed to eat and this is what you're not supposed to eat, and that's it. The Torah doesn't explain why. The Torah doesn't say don't eat these animals because ... It just says don't do it. So we don't do it. God said don't do it, so we don't do it. There's actually a principle in Judaism about why we follow commandments that have no logical reason for them, because that in itself is an act of faith. It could be, one of the theories is that it was related in the ancient world to cultural separation or distinctiveness. That we had our Jewish practice, we worshiped God, other people worshiped idols, and so in order to keep separate from the cultures around us in ancient Israel, we had particular dietary practices. So, for example, we know from archaeological excavation that Philistines and Canaanites, who were some of our neighbors, did eat pork, and they ate it as a staple food. So by saying pork is forbidden, any pig products are forbidden, that means you're not going to be going to the next town over and socializing and celebrating with these idol worshippers instead of worshiping God. It's about cultural separation. That's probably the predominant theory right now about kashrut, although these theories, as new evidence is always coming up, theories come and go. You may have heard a theory that it's related to health. For most of the 20th century, this is what was taught to rabbis, was taught in synagogues. Many of you have probably heard this before because it may have been what you were taught, that kashrut is all about health, that pork was forbidden because Pork, if it's not cooked properly, can give you trichinosis. And shellfish can give you salmonella. Excuse me. And mixing meat and dairy can lead to cross-contamination. If you have some raw meat and then you cook it and then you put your dairy on top of that same surface, you've got cross-contamination and you can get really sick. So all of these things are all about this early understanding of health. They didn't know why people were getting sick. They just knew people were getting sick, and so they prohibited it. And it's this early insight into human biology, this early insight that Judaism possessed. That theory doesn't really stand up. It's you won't find any scholars that are still teaching this, because we know from evidence that if it was about health, well, actually, pork is not necessarily any more unhealthy than beef or goat, depending on how you treat it. Because guess what? Those things can make you sick too. What about chicken? If it was all about health, you would think that chicken, which can give you salmonella and all sorts of other diseases if it's not cooked properly, just like pork can. So why should chicken be allowed, but pork is forbidden? So that particular theory, we have a lot of evidence suggesting that really had nothing to do with health reasons, which is why, again, the number one reason at the top of the list, nobody knows. And maybe that's the point. Maybe it's not supposed to be something that we understand. Maybe it's supposed to be something that we take on faith. What about modern kashrut? How does this work in modern life? There are dozens of different organizations that certify kashrut, that say this is allowed, this is prohibited, this is kosher, and this isn't. If you look at after class, go into your kitchen, pick up any box of food, bag, cereal, canned food, and take a look at it. And if you look very closely, odds are it's very likely that you'll see one of these symbols somewhere on that package. One of the most common ones is up here at the top left, the OU. That's a O, a circle with a U inside of it. That's the Orthodox Union. Right next to that, you see the OK, or the circle K. That's another very common one. Right next to that, you see star K. These are different organizations that employ rabbis to go out and certify, okay, what this company is making is kosher. If you work in food manufacturing, import, export, you may have some familiarity with these, in fact. Now, where it gets complicated is that depending on the Jewish community, and I'm talking about Orthodoxy here only, depending on the Orthodox community, some of these symbols may be considered reliable, and some of them may be considered questionable. And that's always an interesting situation where you say, okay, this one has a kashrut, but it's not allowed by my rabbi because this symbol isn't considered reliable enough, or it doesn't have the right standard, so can't use it. There's also a growing idea in Judaism that kashrut, this whole idea of taking our mundane activity of eating and making it something holy, that we should have a totally different approach. And you will not see this on any of your food. The Tav Hayoshav, which is the ethical seal, meaning this is not just kosher in the sense of it follows the ritual law, but it's ethical in that the workers are paid, in that the animals are well treated. One of the ideas about kashrut is that in early times, it forced people to treat their animals well. That animal cruelty was not permitted. One of the, in fact, the word for not kosher, if you want to say something is not kosher, the word is treif. And the word treif or treif means torn. And it refers to the biblical prohibition to tearing or cutting a limb off of an animal that's still alive to eat it. That's not kosher, it's treif. Now, why would you do that? Imagine you're out in the wilderness, you're hungry, you're on your own, you've got your flock of sheep. Maybe it's not a very big flock, maybe you've only got 5 or 6 sheep. There's no refrigeration. If you kill a sheep, you're not going to be able to eat the whole thing. So maybe you think, okay, I'm just going to take the back leg, I'm going to let it heal up, and then I've got, I can eat, and then I still have a sheep. I've got I can have my cake and eat it too. It seems unthinkable to us in modern times because we have refrigeration, because we have distribution networks, because we have social networks where we don't have to waste food in that way. But in ancient times, it may have been thought of as a very simple solution. But the ancient Israelites, even if you were in that situation, you're not permitted because it's cruel. And if it's really the essence of kashrut is connected with making eating holy, making the whole process of food preparation sacred, maybe we need to take a closer look at how we're eating and how we're choosing what we're eating. The reason that I keep kosher is not because the Torah says so, although that obviously is an important part to me. For me, keeping kosher changes my relationship with the food that I eat. It forces you to think about what's in your food and how it got there. Because it forces you to think about the practice, the process of how that food came to be on your plate. And once you start thinking about your food that way, once you start thinking about what's actually in your food, what are the ingredients, when you start looking at the side of the box and reading that list of ingredients and say, oh, I don't know what that is, I need to find out, it changes your relationship with your food. And maybe the best thing that we can do with kashrut is to take that approach, change our relationship with our food, focus more on not the final product, but in everything that goes in to the process of bringing that product to your plate.